Welcome back to today's lecture. Our next chapter that we'll be starting is chapter 23 in your textbooks, and this is the urinary system. As you are probably aware, the urinary system's main function is to excrete or rid the body of waste products, and as they do that, of course, they will be playing a role in several other functions as well. We've already noted the kidney's role in blood volume and blood pressure regulation. We've also previously noted the role that the kidneys play in red blood cell production through their release of the hormone erythropoietin. So it is a vital system because maintaining proper blood chemistry by ridding the body of wastes is critically important, and if this system fails, it doesn't take long for the other systems in the body to fail as well. Of interest here is that the urinary system is closely associated with the reproductive system, and by that what we mean is that ovaries, testes, and kidneys all essentially develop from the same patch of embryonic tissue, and the gonads, the ovaries and testes, have to descend from that position up by the kidneys down into their later position in the adult. The urinary system, somewhat like the endocrine system, is a fairly simple system in terms of just gross anatomy. There aren't actually that many organs involved in the system, but physiologically it's a very complex system. In terms of the organs of the system, there's really only about 5 major organs. The kidneys themselves are the main organ of the system that do all the physiology, all the modification of blood chemistry. We have a tube that leads from each kidney known as a ureter. The job of this tube, of course, is to transport urine away from the kidneys once it's produced and carry it to a storage site, which is down in the pelvic cavity, known as the urinary bladder. The bladder stores the urine until we decide it's time to release it, and when we do release it, it passes out of the body through a tube known as the urethra. And that's it in terms of the overall gross anatomy of the system. Those are the organs, but of course we have to look at each organ more carefully, and again, as we discuss the physiology, we'll see it's somewhat complex. Now, we mentioned the main function of the urinary system, but want to go through some detailed functions, and you can see there's actually quite a few different functions for the urinary system. Of course, their main role, as we said earlier, is to rid the body of metabolic wastes. This, by the way, is known as excretion. Ridding the body of metabolic waste is known as excretion. This is different from elimination. Elimination is what the digestive system does primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. The digestive system also does a little excretion. But most of what the digestive system is called elimination. That's ridding the body of materials that never were actually digested or became part of the system. So if your child eats a marble and that marble passes all the way through unchanged, that would be elimination, not excretion, because that marble never actually became a part of the body, and it doesn't represent a waste product produced by the body. So there is a difference between elimination, which is what the digestive system primarily does, and excretion, which is getting rid of metabolic wastes. Now, some people call the urinary system the excretory system because of this. I prefer not to call it the excretory system because, in my opinion, that limits it to just one narrow aspect of its function. What the urinary system really does, in addition to excretion, is it essentially filters the blood of all materials that are in excess. In other words, we don't just use the urinary system to get rid of toxic metabolic wastes. We use the urinary system essentially to rid the body of any blood component that's in excess. So if I have too much sodium, that will wind up in the urine. If I have too much potassium, that will wind up in the urine. If I have too much glucose, that could wind up in the urine. Even if I have too much water, something as basic as water, that will end up in the urine. And so the kidneys really do much more than just filter the blood trying to excrete metabolic wastes. They filter the blood trying to get rid of anything that is in an imbalance. And so really, I think a better overall description of the function of the urinary system is to maintain blood chemistry. Not just to excrete waste, but overall to maintain proper blood chemistry by either conserving or getting rid of various components of the plasma that we have either in excess or we don't have enough of. And so this is the critical main role of the urinary system. Now, by virtue of regulating how much water is in the blood plasma, of course, we know that also affects blood volume. And by affecting blood volume, that's going to affect blood pressure. And also by affecting water balance, that's going to affect the overall osmolarity of the plasma. As I said earlier, of course, it regulates electrolytes in addition to anything else that's in excess or a deficit in the plasma. And that, by the way, also includes hydrogen ions. And remember, the concentration of hydrogen ions is what determines the acidity of a solution. And so by virtue of regulating electrolytes, specifically hydrogen ions, the kidneys work with the respiratory system in acid-base balance as well. As I mentioned earlier, of course, the kidneys, recall, secrete the hormone erythropoietin, which we know is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, erythropoiesis, in the red bone marrow. Recall something else we talked about. Of course, we talked about this in Anatomy and Physiology 1, but the kidneys are involved in regulation of calcium levels because of their role in the synthesis of calcitriol. Remember, calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. And so, just to make a long story short, that process of vitamin D synthesis begins in the skin in response to ultraviolet radiation, has an intermediate step in the liver, where we convert the skin's product to calcidiol, and then finally ends up in the kidneys, where calcidiol is converted to its functional form of calcitriol. The kidneys can help remove hormones from the blood. Again, monitoring blood chemistry to maintain proper blood chemistry. So that includes hormones. And so it's one of the ways that the effect of hormones diminishes over time, is that the kidneys will remove them from the bloodstream. The kidneys do play a role in detoxifying damaging free radicals that can cause oxidation and damage to tissues. And then, as you see here, in extreme conditions, specifically starvation, the kidneys can convert amino acids in the blood to glucose to use as a fuel molecule. So they are doing quite a bit for us. But again, the main function that's distributed throughout this is monitoring and regulating blood chemistry. And as I mentioned earlier, if blood chemistry starts to deviate from normal levels, that's going to affect every other organ system in the body. And death from kidney failure is fairly rapid due to this effect on other systems. Here we see a photograph, a cadaver picture of the kidneys. Remember or recall that the kidneys are retroperitoneal, meaning they are very far back on the abdominal cavity wall behind the peritoneum, and you can see we tend to encase them in fat, adipose tissue, to protect them. They're also quite a bit higher than most people think, just underneath the liver and up by the stomach. The stomach would be right about in this location right here. Okay, so when we talk about excretion, we said excretion was the removal of metabolic wastes from the body. So what do we mean exactly by metabolic waste? Well, a waste product, of course, is anything that's in the body that is unnecessary or in excess of what we need. So if we have too much sodium in our tissues, that would be a waste product because it's in excess. It's not that sodium isn't useful, it's just that there's too much of it. And then sometimes we produce byproducts that have no function and we need to get rid of those. So that's a waste product. A metabolic waste is one that's produced by the body. So sodium tends not to be produced by the body. It can be in excess due to excessive sodium intake, for instance, but it's not a metabolic waste because it's not a byproduct of some chemical reaction taking place inside our cells. So metabolic waste is a waste product that is manufactured by cells in the course of normal metabolism, normal chemical reactions. Now, there are various kinds of metabolic wastes. Many of them are referred to as nitrogenous waste products because, of course, nitrogenous waste products contain nitrogen, and they derive largely from protein metabolism. Because remember, proteins are organic compounds that contain the amino group, and the amino group is a nitrogen bound to two hydrogens. And so because proteins contain lots of nitrogen, when we metabolize proteins, we tend to get nitrogenous wastes. We see that urea, this compound known as urea, is the principal nitrogenous waste of the body. It's not the only nitrogenous waste, but it is the principal one, constituting about 50% of all of the body's nitrogenous wastes. And urea essentially comes from the breakdown of proteins into amino acids. And when we metabolize those amino acids, of course, again, the amino group is removed, and that amino group is then catalyzed into forming ammonia. Ammonia is a fairly toxic compound, so we can't have tons of ammonia accumulating in the tissues. And so what happens is that ammonia is sent to the liver, where the liver does one of its main jobs, which is usually detoxification. And the liver converts ammonia to a less toxic compound known as urea. And again, that constitutes about 50% of the nitrogenous wastes. There are other types of nitrogenous wastes, actually many other types. The two more common types of alternate types of nitrogenous waste are uric acid. Uric acid results from nucleic acid catabolism. Remember, nucleic acids consist of a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and then one of several nitrogenous bases. And again, there's that clue, right? Nitrogenous bases, nitrogen-containing bases. These are the adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, and uracil that we find in the DNA and the RNA. Again, all containing nitrogen. And so when we break those down, a byproduct or a waste product of nucleic acid breakdown or catabolism is this thing known as uric acid. And then another very common nitrogenous waste is something called creatinine. Creatinine is the result of creatine phosphate breakdown. You may recall creatine phosphate as part of the phosphagen system that muscle cells use to provide a quick few seconds worth of initial energy for muscle contraction. So once the skeletal muscle exhausts its stored ATP, it then turns to creatine phosphate for a source of high energy phosphates to recreate ATP very quickly so that the muscle can continue contraction. Remember, this stored ATP and creatine phosphate system only really provides enough energy to fuel about 4 to 10 seconds worth of muscle contraction. But at any rate, we do have a storage of creatine, and sometimes we break that creatine down, and the product of creatine breakdown is something called creatinine. When you when you have your annual physical and they draw blood and do blood work on you, one of the common things that is measured is blood urea nitrogen, which is abbreviated as BUN. BUN is essentially a measure of the overall level of nitrogenous wastes that are circulating in the blood. A typical BUN would be 10 to 20 milligrams per deciliter, tenth of a liter. And of course, if you are abnormal in your BUN, it may indicate that the kidneys are not doing their job. Whenever anything is in excess in the blood, one of the possibilities is that the kidneys are not performing properly, because normally, again, they would maintain proper blood chemistry. There's a couple of different types of elevated BUN levels. Azotemia is an elevated BUN level that is asymptomatic, meaning that you don't really, the patient doesn't have any symptoms, no complaints, but the BUN is slightly elevated. And so this may be an indicator of the start of some kind of renal problems or renal insufficiency. A more serious condition is uremia. Uremia is an elevated level of blood urea specifically, and it is usually indicative of renal failure because the urea is so high that it's starting to have negative effects on the body. And you see here some of the symptoms of uremia: diarrhea, vomiting, abnormal respiratory rates, dyspnea, cardiac problems, fibrillation, arrhythmia, things like that can result from it. And this is all from the toxicity of the buildup of urea, and usually associated with it other nitrogenous wastes as well. Also, usually other things are out of balance as well, like sodium ions, potassium ions, and that is another thing that starts affecting the nervous system by disrupting membrane potentials. At any rate, this is usually a sign of renal failure, and so treatment would be something like either dialysis or organ transplant if a donor can be identified. All right, and here we see just the chemical diagrams, the structural diagrams for the various nitrogenous wastes that we just talked about. Ammonia, again, just being a derivative of the amino group on amino acids. Urea, when we start placing more than one ammonia group together or amino group together to make urea. Uric acid, which is derived from the nitrogenous basis of nucleic acids. And then creatinine, which is derived from creatine phosphate. So again, some people like to call this this system the excretory system. So again, just to emphasize, excretion and elimination are different. Excretion is removing waste products from the body's fluids, like blood plasma, and getting rid of them. And again, I avoid the word elimination here to avoid any confusion with the physiological process of elimination. So I tend to avoid using this word as I describe excretion. Now, of course, that is, again, a main role of the urinary system, but the urinary system is not the only system that performs excretion. We have seen other systems perform excretion as well. So remember, the respiratory system is involved in removing carbon dioxide from the blood. And of course, carbon dioxide is a waste product, a metabolic waste that comes from chemical reactions that occur in the body. So it is a metabolic waste. And the respiratory system, of course, is the principal way that we get rid of that. We also excrete some water as we breathe. There's always water vapor coming out during expiration as well. We know from AMP1 that the integumentary system excretes several things in the form of sweat, mostly water, but some salts, lactic acid as well. And as we may have mentioned in AMP1, there's actually a little bit of urea in sweat as well. I mentioned that the digestive system's main role is elimination, but I did mention that the digestive system does a little bit of excretion as well. So of course water, there's some water in the feces, salts, a little bit of carbon dioxide, some lipids in the feces as well. Bile pigments are excreted through the digestive system. That's what gives the feces their color, is the breakdown or the pigments that are in bile. And you may recall from our first chapter this semester, those bile pigments ultimately derive from hemoglobin and the breakdown of hemoglobin. Some cholesterol is excreted via the feces, and a variety of other minor waste products. So while the main role, again, of the digestive system is elimination, there are some things that are excreted as well. Okay, so it is time for us to now talk about the anatomy of the kidney. We are on objective 11 in our objectives. You see, when you section a kidney, it's got some interesting internal structure, and there are some hollow spaces in there, and clearly seems to be organized into separate lobes, functional lobes. So we're going to talk about the names and function of all these different internal parts of the kidney. And here we see a diagram of a kidney next to a photograph of a cadaver kidney. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the kidneys are retroperitoneal, meaning very far back behind the peritoneum in the abdominal cavity, and really most of the system is retroperitoneal. So the ureters are behind the peritoneum, the bladder sits behind and beneath the peritoneum in the pelvic cavity. Even the blood vessels that supply it with blood are retroperitoneal, as are the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. They're a bit higher than most people think. So your last rib, your final rib, that vertebral rib that doesn't attach to anything on the front, doesn't make it all the way up to the sternum, in other words, crosses right at the mid-level of the left kidney. The right kidney is a little bit lower, and it's shifted down because of the liver, which tends to be occupy more space on the right side of the body. So here again we see a section, a transverse section through the body showing the liver and its position in the body. In terms of shape and size, it is about the shape of a kidney bean. I'm not actually sure which came first, the bean or the organ. Probably the organ. And it's about the size of a bar of soap, just to give you a rough idea of how big the kidneys are. Again, being shaped like a kidney bean, one side is convex, and the medial side, the side facing the center of the body, is concave, meaning depressed. And that gives it its characteristic kidney bean shape. And on the medial side and that concave side, there's a little opening, a little slit-like opening called the hilum. The hilum is the slit-like opening on the medial concave side of each kidney. This hilum is what allows vessels to exit and enter the kidneys. What has to enter and exit? Various things. We've got nerves that need to supply the kidney tissue. We've got, of course, blood vessels, perhaps the most important things, because the job of the kidneys is to filter blood, so we need a good blood supply. Lymphatic vessels, like any organ, to prevent the buildup of excess interstitial fluid. And then, of course, the ureter has to be able to pass out of the kidney carrying urine away. Now, as I said, the kidneys are retroperitoneal, so they're not protected by a peritoneum, but they are protected. They are protected by various levels of connective tissue. And so there's actually 3 layers of connective tissue that support or protect the kidney, and these are known as the renal fascia, the the perirenal fat capsule, and the fibrous capsule of the kidney itself. So the fibrous renal fascia, that's a type of connective tissue that sits just beneath the parietal peritoneum. So again, remember, it being retroperitoneal, we're behind the peritoneum. So immediately behind the peritoneum is this fascia, this connective tissue, and it basically binds the kidneys and the adrenal glands to the abdominal wall. The perirenal fat capsule is then beneath that renal fascia, and this provides a very nice cushion for the kidney, and just by filling space helps gently hold the kidneys within the renal fascia. The fibrous capsule is, you might consider, part of the kidney itself. It is right on the surface of the kidney. It is actually the surface layer of the kidney itself. It's as you see in the objective 14, it's like a cellophane wrapper around the kidney. It anchors at the hilum and then surrounds the rest of the kidney. It does help protect the kidney from trauma a little bit, though not nearly as much as the fat, perirenal fat and the renal fascia. It's more important in protecting the kidneys from infection because it is a continuous barrier that microbes like bacteria and viruses would have a difficult time penetrating if it is intact. All right, we do have discrete collagen fibers that run from the fibrous capsule to the renal fascia. These also assist helping the kidneys, holding the kidneys in place. But it is interesting to note that the kidneys are not rigidly held in space. There is some flexibility. And so notice on this last bullet, which I just find interesting, the kidneys can drop about 3 centimeters, which is just a little bit over an inch, when you move from a prone position, a lying down position, to a standing up position. Just about an inch worth of wiggle room there, or give or flexibility. So they're not rigidly held in place. They are loosely held in place. Okay, I said that this lecture would be about 25 minutes to complement the end of the respiratory system. And so we're at 27 minutes right now, so this is probably a good place to stop for today. Next time we're going to pick up and continue our discussion of the structure of a kidney. And once we get through structure, of course, then we'll be able to talk about the physiology, the function. Until next time, take care and stay safe.